Welcome to the Wannabe Theologian podcast. I'm your wannabe theologian, Paul Hess. Thanks for tuning in today. Last week we started our Verses and Catechisms episodes as part of this podcast, with the goal of it being to get more regular content out for you all. And here we're doing this again today. So last week we started our look at Genesis 1:1 and tried to determine what we can learn from that passage that would apply to our doctrine of God. And so last week was part 1, and this week is going to be part 2 out of a total of four parts. So again, what does Genesis 1:1 say? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So last week we discussed a couple different things. The first is how our theology must begin with God. We don't start with ourselves. We don't start with something else. We start with God, because that's where the Bible starts. And secondly, we also looked at the necessity of God's self-revelation for us to know God. God is not just something out there that we can learn about on our own, do it our own way. No, we are dependent upon God revealing himself to us, just as we owe our existence to God, and so must our knowledge of God come from him through God's self-revelation. So what can we learn about? What are some of the things we learn about? Well, one of the things I want to talk about is monotheism. Monotheism, that's basically a word that it's two phrases joined together, mono referring to one, and theism referring to the study of God. So monotheism, basically we're saying that this passage, Genesis 1:1, teaches that there is only one God. Well, let's look at the passage. Go through and see how many gods you have in this passage. If you look, you'll find there's just one. There's only one God. So right there we have a pretty clear indication of how many gods there are. What we don't have in this passage is a commentary of how one of several gods, one of a pantheon, created all things. No, there's just one. Now, if you look in the original Hebrew, the word for God used in Genesis 1:1 is Elohim, which in the Hebrew is a plural. Now, even though we have a plural attached to this name, how many beings do we have in this verse? Just one. Even though that word Elohim is plural, you're not seeing multiple beings, multiple individuals. You are seeing one being, just one God. Now, as Christians, while we obviously are monotheists, we believe in one God, many others do not. There are some ancient heresies within the Christian orb that reject this, and even some modern ones as well. You have the ancient Gnostics, who suggested that the God referenced here is just a lower level God who created the world. There were a whole bunch, a whole litany of them, a whole tiered structure, and the one who created things was kind of on the bottom rung. The Mormons, the modern-day Latter-day Saints Church, they also suggest that Elohim is simply the name of the God who created this particular world. They believe that there are many gods who created many other worlds. In fact, they have an infinite number of gods and an infinite number of worlds. And so what they're saying is the word that we translate as God in our English Bibles is the original word Elohim is simply a reference. It's just the name for one particular God. How do we look at this? We read this verse with and see monotheism in it, but others decide, well, no, there's multiple gods. What do we do with this? Well, does the idea of multiple gods arise naturally from the text? Can you look at this verse and naturally reading it, get the idea that there are multiple gods? No, you really cannot. The idea of multiple gods has to be imposed on the text. It's not something you can draw from it naturally. Look at one of the phrases in here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Heavens and earth. That phrase there is, the writer of Genesis is trying to communicate all things. From the highest of heights to the deepest depths, all things are included in this. God created all things. No matter how high you go, no matter how low you go, all things have been created by God. There's nothing left out of this. And moreover, what the writer of Genesis is trying to do is clearly communicate God's supremacy over all things. If God has created the highest thing, the heavens, well, then God is supreme over that which is highest, and therefore God is the highest of all. We're talking about God's absolute supremacy. So, if we were to imagine that Elohim, God, was just one of many, well, how could he be supreme over all? No, there must only be one, because there can be only one supreme over all. You can't have two supremes over all, because then there's something over which you're not supreme. That just doesn't work. So what we're getting here is the clear communication of one God who is supreme over all things. But again, if we go beyond this passage and look at the context of Genesis 1:1, we see the rest of the creation account through the end of chapter 1 of Genesis. And throughout that chapter, God has continued to work out his purposes in creation. God is separating the light from the dark on day 1, light from the darkness on day 1. He is creating the sun, moon, and stars on day 4. He's creating man on day 6, and so on. Throughout all this, there's no one who does, and no one who even tries to interfere in this creative process. Neither is anyone else involved in making it happen. This is God's action. It is God who's working here. This is meant to be a clear contrast to the pagan thinking at the time that Genesis was written. If you look at some of the pagan accounts of creation, you find that they have a whole bunch of gods. One god does this part of creation, another one does that part, and this other god does another part, and so on. Or you've got warring gods. So you've got a god who's trying to create things, and another one's come along and trying to mess things up and causing problems and stuff like that. This is Genesis 1 is meant to be a polemic against those pagan ideas of multiple gods. It's setting the Christian view apart from the pagan view. And so what if Genesis 1 allowed for the possibility of multiple gods, then it's no longer arguing against any sort of pagan notion. It is pagan. But it's because the Bible is teaching, and Genesis 1:1 is teaching that there's only one God that can speak to the paganism of the surrounding culture. Now, we can look at other biblical passages that comment on what's going on in Genesis 1, either by direct commentary or by allusion. One of those passages is Hebrews 11, verse 3, and I'll read it here. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. Again, there's a lot we can unpack out of this particular verse. But again, it's the first part that we care about. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God. Okay? Worlds. That's a comprehensive term. All things were created by God. There's no other category of thing, no other category of being here. There's only God, and there's creation. How about John chapter 1? We look at verses 1 through 3. I'll read it here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him nothing came into being that has come into being. Okay, this is a famous passage that speaks to the divinity of Jesus. At some point we're gonna come back to this passage because there's a lot that can be said here. But here we have a clear allusion to Genesis 1:1, in the beginning. Okay, John is clearly trying to get us to think back to Genesis 1, and then he says, "All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being." All right, so we have God, we have creation. John 1:3 has no other category. That is it. There is nothing else being said here. If all things came into being through the work of God, so there can't have been another category of being, because then that being would have had its own thing apart from God and apart from creation. But here John 1:3 is saying anything that has being came into being through the work of God. There's only one God. Then finally, if we look at Colossians 1, verses 15 through 17. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now, that was a pretty comprehensive list. And here where we're talking, the Apostle Paul is talking about Jesus, who, as we know, is God. And so he's including everything here. There is only one God. If there's anything else other than God, it was created by God. There cannot possibly be another God. And this leads us to something that you may have heard from apologetics called the cosmological argument. This is an argument used to defend the Christian faith against unbelievers, to demonstrate that God must exist. And the Christian creator God must be true, that there must only be one God. The argument basically goes as follows. Every effect has a cause. If I'm waving my hand, the muscles had to move in my arm to get my hand to move. If I throw a ball, the ball moves because I threw it, and so on. Every effect has a cause. And so if you think about it here, what is the cause of our universe? Our universe being the effect. Well, the cause must be God. Well, can God have his own cause? Well, if he didn't, if he does have a cause, then he's just part of creation. And you just keep going back. At some point, you have to stop and say, okay, there must be something in creation that is uncaused. You can't go infinitely far back. You have to stop somewhere, because things we exist. We must explain why we do, and you have to start with some uncaused cause. So some being who is uncaused, and that is God. And that's what, again, we have this similar idea here. We can this cosmological argument we can draw from Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created. God, there is your first cause, the uncaused cause. So monotheism is one of the most important things we can draw from this particular passage. There is only one God. What else can we learn? Well, the second thing we can learn is we can learn one of the attributes of God, and that is God's omnipotence. Well, what's that? Well, let's look at it this way. One of the things we can see in this passage is we learn of God's power. Think of the immense power that God must have in order to bring everything out of nothing. Nothing isn't empty space. Nothing is nothing. I think it was Aristotle who said, nothing is what rocks dream about. Okay? Nothing is nothing. But here we are, God bringing the entire universe, both the material world and the spiritual world, into existence like that. What intense power must that have? Think of a nuclear bomb. How much power is bound up in that bomb? Think of the power of our sun. The sun has an incredible amount of power, and our sun is a small star. There are billions upon billions of stars in our universe, an untold number of stars, many of them bigger than our own sun. If these stars have that much power, how much power must God have to bring them into being, to uphold them? God must have a limitless power to bring all these things into existence and continue to uphold them. We struggle as it is to modify things that already exist. We don't create things out of nothing. No, we create new things from what already exists. And that takes enough power and work and effort as it does. But imagine bringing something out of nothing. That's an insane amount of power. And the thing is, since there is only one God, as we previously established, what in all creation could possibly limit God's power? There's nothing. All these created things were created by the power of God. So then how could they withstand his power? What could stay his hand? Nothing. And that's what we mean by God's omnipotence. Omni meaning all, potence meaning power. God has all power, and there is nothing that can withstand, restrain, or limit God's power. God's power is infinite. There's no limit on it whatsoever. And this is one of God's incommunicable attributes. Incommunicable, that's something we discussed in one of our very earliest episodes. God's omnipotence is incommunicable. It is something that is reserved for God and God alone. It is not something you find in creation. And that brings us to our third and final thing we're going to talk about today, and that we can see in Genesis 1:1 the creator-creature distinction. I've mentioned this a lot. I've even alluded to it here in this particular podcast. We see in Genesis 1:1 the creator-creature distinction that we've talked a lot about. Before creation was even what was present, God was already there. God already existed in his fullness. Again, look at it. In the beginning, God created. There's God. Right there. He's already there in all of his fullness. And so we have these two categories. You have God who created, and then the heavens and the earth, that which is created by God. Creation's existence is derivative. We do not have to exist. God already existed. And because our existence is derivative, whereas God's is not, our existence must be necessarily different from God's. Our existence as creatures, and this could go for us as humans, for my dog, which is lying right over there next to me, for the tree in your backyard, anything else. All these are creaturely things, and because we're creaturely, our existence is derivative. Another way we can say it is that our existence is contingent. There is no reason why we must exist. We exist because of something else. There is some cause to our existence, and we do not exist without that cause. On the other hand, if we talk about God, God's existence is what we call necessary. To roughly define it, in other words, God cannot not exist. Let me state that again. God's existence is necessary. That is, God cannot not exist. And so if we look at Genesis 1:1, the Bible's making clear that there are only two categories of being: God and what God has made. Those are the only two categories. And since our existence as creatures is contingent and God's existence is necessary, we cannot draw a straight line between our creaturely existence and God's divine existence. Now, I think back to one of our earliest episodes. We talked about different types of language and how we must speak about God. We talked about univocal language, where it's using the same words in essentially the same sense. Equivocal, which is using the same words in two entirely different senses. And analogical, which is using a word in similar but distinct senses. In that episode, we talked about how we must use analogical language about God. And this comes from our creator-creature distinction. Because we as creatures are contingent and God is necessary, we cannot make statements about God that are univocal to something about our existence and experience. You cannot have something univocal between something that is necessary and something that is contingent. But because God has created us and has revealed himself to us, we cannot say that there is no contact, no linguistic contact between us and God. No way for us to speak truly of God. This is why we need analogical language. And this is something we talked about at length because it's so important. We cannot use univocal language because that makes God creaturely. We can't use equivocal language because that makes God unknowable. This is why we need analogical language. It allows us to maintain the proper distinctions while still being able to speak truly, if not exhaustively, of God. If you have found this podcast helpful, as always, like and subscribe and share this podcast with your friends. Hopefully they can be blessed by it too. As always, you can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Anchor FM, Apple Podcasts. As always, I'm grateful for you listening. Have a blessed day.